My mom paid for the education and expenses of my golden brother, but she forced me to take a loan and pay $900 for rent. I don't even know where to start. My name's Alice, and I'm 36 years old. If you asked me to describe my childhood in one word, it would be invisible. Growing up in my family felt like being in a play where the spotlight was always on someone else. Nick, my older brother. I was just there, somewhere in the background. Nick and I were born 3 years apart, but it might as well have been 20. From the moment I can remember, my parents treated him like he was some kind of golden child, while I was just an afterthought. I think it started with the little things. Nick's first birthday was a full-blown event. Balloons, a catered party, a cake shaped like a race car. When I turned one, my mom slapped together some cupcakes and called it a day. As we got older, the gap grew wider. Nick got everything handed to him on a silver platter. For his 8th birthday, they bought him a brand new bicycle, the kind all the kids in the neighborhood were obsessed with. Me? When I turned 8, I got a second-hand dollhouse with a missing roof. But it wasn't just about gifts. It was about support, attention, love. When Nick joined Little League, my dad cleared his whole schedule to take him to practices, to cheer at every game, to shout his name from the stands. When I tried out for the school choir and got a solo, no one even bothered to show up to the concert. Sorry, honey, Nick's game ran late. My mom said that night, ruffling my hair like it was no big deal. I don't think I realized how deeply it hurt back then. As a kid, you don't have the words to explain why it feels like you're constantly being measured and found lacking. You just feel it. It was like this heavy weight pressing down on me all the time. This unspoken truth that I wasn't good enough. Nick loved the attention, of course. He soaked it all in, but he wasn't exactly a brat about it. That almost made it worse. He was just naturally charming, naturally talented, the kind of person everyone liked without even trying. I couldn't hate him for it, but I couldn't help resenting the way everyone, including our parents, gravitated toward him. One summer, when I was about 10 and Nick was 13, my parents took us on a family trip to Florida. I remember being so excited because it was my first time at the beach. But even on that trip, I felt like an outsider. My parents spent the whole week watching Nick try out for some junior lifeguard program. Meanwhile, I spent most of the trip wandering the shore alone, picking up shells and wondering why I even bothered trying to get their attention. The worst part was school. My teachers adored Nick. "Oh, you're Nick's sister," they'd say, their faces lighting up. "He's such a great student. I bet you're just like him." I wasn't. I was quieter, more reserved. I didn't get straight A's like Nick did, but I worked hard. It didn't seem to matter. By the time I got to middle school, I had given up trying to compete with him. Things came to a head when I was 15. Nick had just been accepted into this fancy prep school on a full scholarship, and my parents threw him a huge party to celebrate. They rented out the community center, invited all our relatives, even hired a photographer. I remember standing in the corner of the room that night, watching my mom fuss over Nick's suit and my dad shake hands with everyone, beaming with pride. No one noticed when I slipped out the back door. I walked all the way home, sat in my room, and cried until my chest ached. It wasn't just about the party. It was the years of feeling like I didn't matter, like I could scream at the top of my lungs and no one would hear me. The next day, I confronted my parents. I don't know what came over me, but something in me just snapped. "Why don't you love me like you love Nick?" I blurted out during breakfast. My mom froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. My dad looked up from the newspaper, confused. "What are you talking about, Alice?" my mom said, her tone dismissive. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice shaking. "You treat Nick like he's the second coming of Christ, and I'm just here. I work just as hard as he does, but you never notice. You never care." For a moment, there was silence. Then my dad sighed and said, "Alice, that's not true. We love you both equally." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah? Then where's my party? Where's my new bike? Where were you when I got my solo in choir? You don't even try to hide it." My mom set her coffee down, her face tight. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "We've always supported you. Maybe if you were more like Nick." "More like Nick?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "That's all you care about. I could cure cancer, and you'd still find a way to make it about him." I stormed out of the room before they could respond, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the day in my room, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was crazy. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was all in my head. Things didn't change after that. If anything, they got worse. My parents started walking on eggshells around me, but their favoritism toward Nick didn't stop. By the time I turned 18, I couldn't wait to get out of that house. I applied to colleges far away, desperate for a fresh start. When I got accepted to a university in California, I didn't even hesitate. Moving across the country felt like finally coming up for air after years of drowning. For the first time, I didn't have to live in Nick's shadow. I made friends who saw me for who I was, not who I was related to. But even in California, the weight of my childhood lingered. I found myself second-guessing everything I did, wondering if I was good enough. Every time I called home, my mom would spend half the conversation talking about Nick, his grades, his internships, his girlfriend. "Your brother's doing so well," she'd say, her voice filled with pride. "You should call him sometime." "I'm busy," I'd reply, my stomach twisting. I tried to move on. I really did. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't enough. When I got into college in California, I thought I had finally found my escape. My acceptance letter was like a golden ticket, a chance to start over and leave behind all the years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. But that relief was short-lived. It started with the money. Nick, of course, got a free ride from my parents. They were so proud of him for getting into Stanford, and they didn't hesitate to foot the bill. Tuition? Covered. Books? Covered. Housing? Covered. They even sent him a generous allowance every month, so he wouldn't have to stress about anything but his studies. Meanwhile, I was told I'd need to contribute. My parents couldn't, or wouldn't, pay for 2 kids in college, so I had to take out loans. "It's just how it is, Alice," my mom said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "Nick's school is an investment. You'll understand when you're older." I don't think I've ever felt so humiliated. I wasn't even asking for much. My tuition was less expensive than Nick's, and I had already secured a partial scholarship. But none of that seemed to matter. My parents made it clear that any extra help they had would go to Nick. To make things worse, they insisted I live at home to save money. I thought that would mean I wouldn't have to pay for rent, but no. My parents charged me $900 a month to live in the same house I'd grown up in. "It's only fair," my dad said. "You're an adult now. You need to learn responsibility." Nick? He lived in a fancy dorm, fully funded by my parents, and never paid a cent. To make ends meet, I picked up 2 jobs. During the day, I worked as a receptionist at a dentist's office. At night, I waited tables at a diner downtown. My schedule was brutal. I'd get up at 6, go to classes, rush to work, and come home exhausted, only to start all over again the next day. I barely slept. I barely ate. And yet, no matter how hard I worked, I could never seem to get ahead. There were nights I'd come home and collapse on my bed, tears streaming down my face, wondering how the hell this was fair. Nick, meanwhile, was living the dream. He'd call home to tell my parents about his trips to the beach, the parties, the clubs. And every time he needed extra money, my mom would send it without hesitation. Once, I overheard her on the phone with him. "Of course, sweetie. I'll transfer the money today," she said, her voice dripping with affection. When she hung up, I confronted her. "Why does Nick get everything handed to him while I have to scrape by?" I asked, my voice shaking. My mom looked at me like I just insulted her. "Don't be ridiculous, Alice. Nick is under a lot of pressure. He's studying hard. You should be proud of him." "I'm studying too." I shot back. "I'm working 2 jobs just to stay afloat, and you can't even—" "Enough," she snapped. "You're not a child anymore. Stop acting like one." That was the end of that conversation. My only solace during that time was my best friend, Claire. We'd met in one of my general education classes, and she quickly became my rock. Claire was blunt, fiercely loyal, and didn't take crap from anyone. When I told her about the $900 rent my parents charged me, she nearly lost it. "That's insane, Alice," she said, shaking her head. "They're your parents. They should want to help you, not bleed you dry." "I know," I said, feeling the familiar knot of anger and shame tighten in my chest. "But what can I do? I don't have anywhere else to go." Claire offered to let me crash at her apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to accept. She was already juggling her own struggles, and I didn't want to be a burden. Things reached a breaking point one night when I came home from work and found my dad sitting in the living room, drinking a beer and watching TV. He barely looked up as I walked past him, but then he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Nick called today," he said. "He's thinking about studying abroad next semester. Isn't that exciting?" I turned to look at him, my jaw clenched. "Studying abroad?" I repeated. "Yeah. Italy, I think," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "Your mom and I are going to help him with the expenses, of course. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was barely scraping by, drowning in debt, and they were funding Nick's semester in Italy? "Of course you are," I said bitterly. My dad frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means you always find a way to give Nick everything he wants, while I get nothing. I snapped. He set his beard down and stood up, his face hardening. Don't you dare talk to me like that, he said. Your mother and I have done everything for you. Maybe if you worked as hard as your brother. Are you kidding me? I interrupted, my voice rising. I'm working 2 jobs. I'm paying rent to live in my own house. How is that fair? Life isn't fair, Alice, he said coldly. You should be grateful for what you have. Grateful. That word echoed in my head as I stormed upstairs to my room, slamming the door behind me. The next day, I was running on fumes as I went through my usual routine. At work, my manager pulled me aside and told me I'd messed up an appointment schedule. You need to get it together, Alice, she said. I nodded numbly, fighting back tears. It felt like everything was falling apart. That night, as I was walking home from the diner, I got a call from Claire. Hey, I know it's late, but do you want to come over? She asked. I hesitated. I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but something in her voice made me say yes. When I got to her apartment, she handed me a cup of tea and sat me down on the couch. You can't keep living like this, Alice, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You're going to burn out. I don't have a choice, I said, staring into my tea. I can't afford to move out, and my parents. Screw your parents, she said, cutting me off. They don't deserve you. You're worth so much more than this. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time in years, someone was telling me I mattered. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks. That night, I made a promise to myself. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I was going to find a way out. Graduating from university with a 4.0 GPA in engineering was supposed to feel like a triumph. For years, I'd poured every ounce of energy into my studies, juggling impossible schedules, fighting through exhaustion, and surviving on little more than caffeine and sheer determination. Walking across that stage in my cap and gown, hearing my name called, and holding that diploma should have been the proudest moment of my life. But as I scanned the crowd, searching for my parents, my stomach sank. They weren't there. I shouldn't have been surprised. They hadn't even called to say congratulations. My mom had texted me that morning. Good luck, sweetie. Nick says hi. That was it. No mention of how hard I'd worked, no acknowledgement of my GPA, nothing about how I'd overcome every obstacle they'd thrown in my way. Just a casual note that, once again, reminded me where I stood in their hierarchy. After the ceremony, my friends and their families gathered outside for photos. Claire was there, grinning from ear to ear and hugging me like a proud parent. You did it, Alice, she said, snapping pictures of me in my cap and gown. But as happy as I was to have her there, it didn't fill the ache in my chest. Later that evening, I called my parents. I don't know why I still felt the need to reach out. Maybe I was hoping, stupidly, that they'd surprise me, that they'd tell me how proud they were. Hey, Mom, I graduated today, I said, my voice tentative. That's great, honey, she said, sounding distracted. Nick's meeting with a recruiter for a big tech company next week. Isn't that exciting? I stared at the wall, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Yeah, that's great for him. Well, we're proud of you too, she said quickly, as if realizing she'd made a misstep. But you know, engineering is such a tough field. You'll have to work hard to find a good job. I know, I said, my voice flat. Thanks for the advice. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my diploma. It felt meaningless. A week later, I packed up my things and moved into my first apartment. It was a tiny one-bedroom unit on the edge of the city, nothing fancy, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to answer to anyone. I could come and go as I pleased, eat what I wanted, decorate however I liked. The rent was steep, $2,000 a month, but I'd landed a solid entry-level job at an engineering firm, and I was determined to make it work. My first few months of independence were a whirlwind. Work was challenging but rewarding, and I threw myself into it with everything I had. My coworkers were friendly, though I kept most of them at arm's length. After years of feeling overlooked and underestimated, I struggled to trust people. One of my colleagues, Ryan, made an effort to get to know me. He was a few years older, with an easygoing demeanor and a knack for making people laugh. At first, I thought he was just being polite, but over time, we started talking more. He'd stop by my desk to chat about projects, invite me to lunch with the team, and check in if I seemed stressed. You're way too hard on yourself, Alice, he said one day after I'd apologized for a minor mistake. You're one of the smartest people here. You don't have to prove anything. His words caught me off guard. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. As much as I liked my job, the financial pressure was relentless. Between rent, utilities, groceries, and my student loan payments, I barely had anything left at the end of each month. I started cutting corners wherever I could, eating ramen for dinner, skipping nights out with friends, walking instead of taking the bus. Saving for a house felt like an impossible dream, but I was determined. I opened a separate savings account and funneled every spare dollar into it, even if it meant going without. Claire called me crazy. "You're 24, Alice," she said one night over drinks. "You're supposed to be living your life, not pinching pennies like some retiree." "I'll live my life once I have something to show for it," I replied, swirling the last bit of wine in my glass. My parents, of course, had no idea about my struggles. Whenever they called, which wasn't often, they'd talk about Nick's latest accomplishments. He'd landed a high-paying job at a startup, bought a new car, and was already looking at condos in Silicon Valley. "That's great," I'd say, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "What about you, Alice?" my mom asked once. "Are you still renting?" "Yeah, but I'm saving up for a house," I said. "Oh," she said, her tone indifferent. "Well, good luck with that." Their lack of interest stung, but I refused to let it hold me back. I worked harder than ever, taking on extra projects at work and picking up freelance gigs on the side. Ryan noticed how often I stayed late and started leaving snacks on my desk with little notes. "Don't forget to eat," or "You're doing great." His kindness was a bright spot in an otherwise grueling routine, and over time, we grew closer. We started spending time together outside of work, grabbing coffee, going for walks, watching movies. He never pushed me to open up, but he listened whenever I felt like sharing. One night, after a particularly stressful day, I broke down and told him about my family, how I'd always felt second best, how I'd had to fight for everything while Nick had it handed to him. "That's awful," Ryan said, his expression serious. "You deserve so much better." I shrugged, wiping away tears. "It is what it is. I want to prove to myself that I can do this, that I can build a life on my own." "You already are," he said. Hearing those words from someone who genuinely believed in me felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. Over the next few years, I kept grinding. Slowly but surely, my savings grew. I found a smaller, cheaper apartment, cut back on unnecessary expenses, and threw myself into my work. By the time I turned 28, I had enough for a down payment on a modest house. The day I signed the papers, I stood in the empty living room and let out a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. This was mine. I'd earned it. When I called my parents to tell them, my mom's reaction was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, Alice," she said. "Nick's thinking about buying a vacation home. Maybe you two can compare notes." I hung up the phone and stared at it, a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside me. But then I looked around at my new home, and the anger faded. They didn't matter. Not anymore. I wasn't living for their approval. I was living for me. Buying my first house was the proudest moment of my life. After years of scraping by, working multiple jobs, and saving every penny, I finally had a place to call my own. It wasn't a mansion, but it was perfect for me. A cozy 3-bedroom house with a small backyard and a charming porch. It felt like a fresh start, a tangible sign of everything I'd worked for. I didn't tell my family. I didn't want to. Part of me feared their response, but mostly, I just wanted this to be mine. I didn't need their approval or their input. This house represented my independence, and I wasn't about to let them taint it. For the first few weeks, everything was blissful. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, painting walls, and arranging furniture. Claire came over with a bottle of wine to celebrate, and we spent hours sitting on the floor of my empty living room, laughing and talking about how far I'd come. "You did this all on your own," she said, raising her glass. "Don't let anyone take that away from you." "I won't," I said, clinking my glass against hers. But as much as I wanted to believe that, life had a way of proving me wrong. The news about my house reached my family faster than I expected. It started with a phone call from my mom. I should have known something was up from the overly cheerful tone in her voice. "Alice, I heard you bought a house. Why didn't you tell us?" she said, her voice laced with a mix of surprise and reproach. "I wanted to keep it private," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "It's just something I needed to do for myself." "Well, it's a big decision. Are you sure you picked the right house?" 3 bedrooms is a lot of space for one person," she said, her words carrying that familiar note of judgment. "It's perfect for me," I said firmly, but she wasn't done. Over the next few days, she called me constantly, asking questions about the house, the neighborhood, the price. She even had the audacity to suggest I should have consulted her and Dad before making such a big purchase. Mom, I'm 30 years old. I finally snapped during one of her calls. I don't need your permission to buy a house. Her response was classic mom. I'm just trying to help, Alice. You don't have to be so defensive. Things took an even stranger turn when Nick got involved. One evening, I came home to find a voicemail from him waiting on my phone. I hadn't spoken to him in months, so his sudden interest was suspicious. Hey, Alice, his message began, his tone overly friendly. Mom told me about your house. Congratulations. Listen, I've been thinking, it might be nice for us to spend more time together as a family. Let's catch up soon. I didn't return his call. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Nick had never been one to reach out unless he wanted something, and I wasn't about to fall into whatever trap he was setting. A week later, my suspicions were confirmed. My mom and Nick showed up at my house unannounced, armed with coffee and pastries like it was some kind of casual visit. I let them in, mostly out of shock, and they wasted no time getting to the point. We were just talking about how great this house is, my mom said, glancing around the living room. But don't you think it's a bit underutilized? What do you mean? I asked, my stomach tightening. Well, she continued, with 3 bedrooms, it's more space than you really need. Nick and I were thinking it might make sense to share it. I stared at her, dumbfounded. Share it? What are you talking about? Nick stepped in, his voice smooth and practiced. What Mom means is, this house could be great for all of us. My lease is up soon, and Amanda and the kids could really use more space. It'd be perfect for a family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're joking, right? This is my house. I bought it. For me. Of course it's your house, my mom said quickly. But families help each other out, Alice. You're always talking about how you want to be closer to us, and this could be a great way to do that. I never said that, I said, my voice rising. And I didn't buy this house for Nick and his family to move in. Nick sighed, his tone turning patronizing. Come on, Alice. You have all this space, and we'd help with the bills. Think about it. It'd be a win-win. I stood there, shaking with anger. For years, I'd worked myself to the bone to achieve something for myself, and now they were trying to take it from me. No, I said firmly. This is my house. You're not moving in. My mom looked hurt, as if I just slapped her. Alice, don't be so selfish. We're trying to do what's best for the family. What's best for the family? I repeated, incredulous. What about what's best for me? For once in my life, can't I have something that's just mine? The conversation escalated from there. My mom accused me of being ungrateful. Nick tried to guilt-trip me by bringing up all the help they'd given me over the years, and I finally lost it. Get out, I said, pointing to the door. Both of you. Get out of my house. They left, but not without parting shots. My mom muttered something about me being difficult, and Nick smirked as he walked out, saying, You'll come around eventually. After they left, I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe their audacity. The house was supposed to be my safe haven, but now it felt tainted by their intrusion. Over the next few weeks, they kept trying to wear me down. My mom called constantly, leaving voicemails about how I was tearing the family apart. Nick sent me texts with links to bigger houses, suggesting I could upgrade and let them have this one. Even my dad, who usually stayed out of these things, chimed in once, telling me I was being unreasonable. I refused to budge. Every time the phone rang, my stomach twisted in knots, but I stood my ground. Claire was my only source of sanity during that time. She reminded me that I didn't owe them anything and that it was okay to put myself first. They'll never stop if you give in, she said one night over dinner. You've got to draw the line. And she was right. This house was mine, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. For the first time in my life, I was learning how to say no, and it felt damn good. Family dinners had always been a minefield, but I didn't realize just how explosive this one would be. My mother had insisted on hosting it at their house, a sprawling 2-story home filled with a mix of outdated furniture and overly sentimental knickknacks. It was supposed to be a casual gathering, just the 4 of us, Mom, Dad, Nick, and me, but I could already feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. I showed up right on time, a bottle of wine in hand as a peace offering. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken and garlic, and my mom greeted me with her usual passive-aggressive warmth. Oh, Alice, you're here, she said, giving me a quick once-over. You look tired. Nice to see you too, Mom, I replied, forcing a smile. Nick arrived shortly after, with his wife Amanda and their 2 kids in tow. Amanda was the picture of perfection, with her blonde hair and polished demeanor, and the kids, Evan and Lily, were already tearing through the house like little whirlwinds. My parents doted on them, showering them with hugs and kisses while I stood awkwardly by the doorway. Dinner started off tense, but manageable. My mom dominated the conversation, talking about the latest gossip from her book club. Nick chimed in occasionally, bragging about a promotion he'd recently gotten at work. Amanda smiled politely, adding her own little anecdotes about the kids' activities. I mostly kept to myself, sipping my wine and waiting for an opportunity to speak. Halfway through the meal, my mom turned to me with that pointed look she always got when she was about to bring up something uncomfortable. "So, Alice," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "Nick mentioned that you've been thinking about buying a house." The table fell silent. My dad set down his fork. Nick smirked, and Amanda glanced at me with feigned curiosity. I swallowed hard, knowing this was my chance to get it over with. "I actually already bought one," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's a 3-bedroom house, just outside the city." The room erupted. "You what?" my mom exclaimed, her eyes widening. "Why didn't you tell us?" Nick leaned back in his chair, his smirk turning into a full-blown grin. "Wow, Alice. Going behind the family's back? Huh?" "I didn't go behind anyone's back," I shot back. "I didn't think it was something I needed to ask permission for." My dad, who had been unusually quiet until now, finally spoke up. His voice was low and heavy, laced with disappointment. "You didn't think to involve us in such a big decision? That's not how families work, Alice." "Really?" I said, my frustration boiling over. "Because it seems like family only works one way around here. When have any of you ever supported me in my decisions?" My mom clutched her chest like I just slapped her. "How can you say that? We've always been there for you." I laughed bitterly. "No, you've always been there for Nick. You paid for his college, his wedding, his lifestyle. Meanwhile, I've been busting my ass to do everything on my own." "Don't be so dramatic," Nick said, rolling his eyes. "You've had plenty of help." "Oh, really?" I snapped. "Did Mom and Dad charge you $900 a month to live at home? Did you work 2 jobs while going to school?" "Because I sure did." Nick shrugged, his smirk returning. "Maybe if you'd asked for help." "I shouldn't have to ask." I interrupted, my voice rising. "You're the golden child, Nick. You always have been. But just because you've had everything handed to you doesn't mean you get to tell me how to live my life." "Enough," my dad said, his voice sharp. "Alice, you're acting like a child. This is why we worry about you. You make these rash decisions, and then you expect everyone to applaud you." "Rash decisions?" I repeated, incredulous. "I worked for years to buy that house. I saved every penny, sacrificed so much, and now I'm finally in a place where I can breathe. And instead of being happy for me, you're all acting like I've done something wrong." My mom's voice was tight with anger. "It's not about being happy for you, Alice. It's about how you've excluded us. We're your family. You should have involved us in this process." "No, you wanted to control it," I said, glaring at her. "Just like you've tried to control everything else in my life." "Well, not this time. This house is mine, and I'm not letting any of you take that away from me." Nick laughed, a cruel edge to his voice. "Relax, Alice. No one's trying to take your house. But let's be real. 3 bedrooms? That's a family home, not a bachelor pad. Mom's right. You should have thought about how this could benefit all of us." I stared at him, my blood boiling. "This is exactly why I didn't tell you. Because I knew you'd try to make it about you." "Don't twist this," my mom interjected, her voice trembling. "We just want what's best for you, Alice. You're so stubborn, always pushing us away. It's no wonder you're—" "Stop," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Don't you dare make this about me being difficult. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to your impossible standards, and I'm done. You don't get to dictate how I live anymore." The room fell silent. My dad stared at his plate. My mom looked like she was on the verge of tears, and Nick just sat there, smug as ever. I stood up, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. "Alice," my mom called after me, her voice wavering. "Don't do this. You're tearing the family apart." I turned to face her, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "No, Mom. You did that a long time ago." I walked out without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. The cool night air hit me like a slap, and I let out a shaky breath. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd finally stood up for myself. But as I drove home, the weight of the confrontation settled over me. My family would never see me for who I was. They'd always see me as less than Nick, as someone who didn't measure up. And no matter how much I achieved, they'd find a way to make me feel small. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, staring at the empty walls of my house. It wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary, my proof that I could survive on my own. And no matter what my family said, no one could take that away from me. I should have known my family wouldn't let things go after that disastrous dinner. At first, it was just a few messages here and there. Passive-aggressive texts from my mom, guilt-laden emails from Nick, all implying I was being unreasonable and selfish. I ignored them, thinking they'd eventually tire themselves out. But I underestimated just how relentless they could be. The messages started to flood in. My mom texted me every day, sometimes multiple times, alternating between guilt-tripping me and pretending to be concerned. Alice, I don't understand why you're shutting us out. We're your family. Family sticks together. Or, Nick's really struggling right now. You could do so much to help if you just stop being so stubborn. Nick wasn't subtle either. He'd send me long, self-pitying texts about how hard it was to raise 2 kids in a cramped apartment, how Amanda was stressed, how he didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. You don't even have kids, Alice, one message read. You don't know what it's like to be in my position. It wouldn't kill you to help us out for a few months. It wasn't just messages. They took to social media too. My mom posted cryptic statuses about the importance of family, complete with Bible verses about generosity and forgiveness. Nick went further, posting pictures of his kids with captions like, "Doing everything I can to give these 2 the life they deserve." Some people just don't understand what it means to sacrifice for family. It was infuriating. I couldn't even scroll through my feed without seeing their attempts to publicly shame me into compliance. Claire noticed it too, and called me one evening to vent on my behalf. "Your family is nuts," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "Who does that? Posting about you online like you're some villain? It's disgusting." "I know," I said, rubbing my temples. "But what am I supposed to do? Block them all?" "Yes," Claire said without hesitation. "Block them, cut them off, whatever it takes. You don't owe them anything, Alice. Don't let them manipulate you." I wanted to take her advice, but part of me hesitated. Blocking them felt so final. Despite everything, they were still my family, and a tiny part of me clung to the hope that they'd eventually come around. But then Nick showed up at my house. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting on the couch in my pajamas, sipping coffee and enjoying the rare peace and quiet. The doorbell rang and I frowned, wondering who it could be. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there he was, Nick, standing on my porch with Amanda and the kids. They were flanked by a few suitcases and duffel bags, like they were ready to move in right then and there. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice flat. "Hey, Alice," Nick said, flashing that practiced, charming smile of his. "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by." "In the neighborhood?" I repeated, crossing my arms. "With all your luggage?" Amanda stepped forward, looking sheepish. "We've been having some trouble with our landlord," she said. "We thought maybe we could stay with you for a little while, just until we figure things out." "No," I said immediately, my tone leaving no room for argument. Nick's smile faltered. "Come on, Alice. It wouldn't be forever. Just a few weeks, maybe a couple of months." "No," I repeated, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind me. "You don't just show up uninvited and expect me to let you move in. I told you already, this is my house. I'm not sharing it with you." Nick's expression hardened. "You're being ridiculous," he said. "We're family. You have all this space, and we're struggling. How can you just turn us away?" "Because I've spent my entire life putting up with this crap," I snapped, my voice rising. "I worked for years to get where I am, and I'm not going to let you guilt me into giving it all up. If you're struggling, that's not my responsibility." Amanda looked like she wanted to say something, but Nick cut her off. "You're unbelievable, Alice," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You act like you're so independent, but you're just selfish. You'd rather see your family suffer than lift a finger to help. That's rich coming from you." I shot back. "You've had everything handed to you your entire life, and now you expect me to bail you out? No. Find someone else to leech off of, because it's not going to be me." Nick's face turned red, and for a moment, I thought he might actually explode. But before he could say anything, Amanda stepped in. "Let's go," she said quietly, grabbing one of the suitcases. "This was a mistake." Nick glared at me, his jaw clenched. "You're going to regret this, Alice. Don't come crying to us when you realize how alone you are." With that, they left, hauling their luggage back to their car and driving away. I stood on the porch, shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. The audacity of it all, the entitlement, the manipulation, the sheer gall of showing up at my house uninvited, left me reeling. I went back inside and slammed the door, my chest heaving. A million thoughts raced through my mind, but one stood out above the rest. I was done. Done with their games, done with their guilt trips, done with trying to make them see my side. They didn't care about me, only what they could get from me. That night, I blocked their numbers. I deleted them from social media. It felt drastic, but it also felt like the only way to protect myself. Claire was thrilled when I told her. Finally, she said, it's about time you stood up for yourself. But as much as I wanted to feel proud of my decision, I couldn't shake the lingering sadness. Cutting ties with my family felt like losing a part of myself, even if that part had always caused me pain. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. I'd gone out that afternoon to pick up a few things from the store. Milk, bread, coffee, the usual. It was a crisp Saturday, and for once, I was feeling a rare sense of peace. The weeks of ignoring my family's endless texts and calls had been difficult, but the silence that followed my decision to block them was worth it. For the first time in months, I could breathe. When I got back home, my arms full of grocery bags, I immediately sensed something was wrong. The curtains in the living room were drawn, and a car I didn't recognize, a silver minivan, was parked in the driveway. My heart sank. No, they wouldn't. Fumbling with the bags, I hurried up the steps to the front door. I didn't need to unlock it. The door was already slightly ajar. My stomach twisted as I pushed it open. The sight that greeted me made me freeze in the doorway. Nick was sprawled out on my couch, his legs kicked up on the coffee table, flipping through the channels on my TV like he owned the place. Amanda was in the kitchen, her back to me, humming as she unpacked what looked like their groceries. Evan and Lily were running up and down the hallway, their laughter echoing through the house. It felt like a nightmare. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my voice sharp and trembling. Nick glanced up, entirely unfazed by my presence. Oh, hey Alice. You're back. I dropped the bags onto the floor, stepping fully into the house. What are you doing here? How did you even get in? Amanda turned to face me, a guilty look flashing across her face before she quickly covered it with a smile. Your mom gave us a spare key, she said. Like that explained everything. My mom. Of course. I'd been careful about keeping my house secure, but during one of her early visits, she must have swiped the spare key I kept in a drawer by the front door. You broke into my house, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You had no right. Relax, Alice, Nick interrupted, sitting up on the couch. We're family. We needed a place to stay, and this house was just sitting here with all this extra space. Mom said it would be fine. Mom said it would be fine? I repeated, incredulous. This isn't her house. She doesn't get to make that call. And neither do you. Amanda stepped forward, her hands outstretched like she was trying to calm me down. We're not trying to take over, Alice. We just needed somewhere safe for the kids. The landlord raised our rent again, and we couldn't afford it anymore. This is temporary, just until we figure things out. Her words might have sounded reasonable if she hadn't been standing in my kitchen, acting like it was hers. No, I said firmly. You don't get to make this decision for me. You need to leave. Now. Nick stood up, his face darkening. Don't be so dramatic, Alice. It's not like we're squatting. We're family. Families help each other. Don't give me that family bullshit. I snapped. You didn't even ask. You just waltzed in here like you own the place. We didn't think you'd mind, Amanda said softly, her eyes darting to Nick for backup. Well, I do mind, I said, my voice rising. You had no right to do this. Get out of my house. Nick crossed his arms, his stance defiant. We're not going anywhere. You're the one being unreasonable. Do you even hear yourself right now? You have all this space, and you're letting your own family struggle because you're too selfish to share. I felt like I was going to explode. This is my house, I said through gritted teeth. I worked for it. I paid for it. And you have no right to be here. The kids, sensing the tension, stopped running around and clung to Amanda's legs, their wide eyes darting between us. Mommy, Lily whispered. It's okay, sweetie, Amanda said, shooting me a pointed look. Aunt Alice is just upset. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. What are you doing? Nick demanded, his face contorting with anger. Calling the cops, I said, holding the phone to my ear. If you won't leave, I'll have them make you. You wouldn't, Amanda said, her voice sharp with disbelief. Try me, I said, glaring at both of them. Nick lunged forward, trying to grab the phone out of my hand, but I stepped back, my heart racing. "Stop it, Nick," I shouted. The dispatcher picked up, and I quickly explained the situation, my voice shaking. "My brother and his family broke into my house. They're refusing to leave. I need help." Nick's face turned red as I gave the dispatcher my address. "You're really doing this? Overreacting like this? To your own family?" he yelled. "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze. "Because you don't get to steamroll me anymore. I'm done." The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Nick paced the living room, muttering under his breath, while Amanda tried to comfort the kids. I stood by the door, my heart pounding, waiting for the police to arrive. When they finally showed up, the officers were professional but firm. They listened to both sides of the story, but it was clear from the start that Nick and Amanda were in the wrong. "You can't just move into someone else's house without permission," one of the officers said, his tone calm but authoritative. "She's our sister," Nick said, as if that excused everything. "Doesn't matter," the officer replied. "If she wants you out, you have to leave." Nick and Amanda reluctantly started gathering their things, their expressions a mix of anger and humiliation. Evan and Lily clung to their parents, crying as they were ushered out the door. Before they left, Nick turned to me one last time. "You'll regret this, Alice," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You're turning your back on your family." I didn't respond. I just watched as they loaded their bags into the minivan and drove away. When the door finally closed behind them, I sank onto the couch, my body trembling. The house felt eerily quiet, the air heavy with the aftermath of what had just happened. I stared at the mess they'd left behind, half-unpacked groceries on the counter, toys scattered across the floor, and felt a surge of anger and sadness. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my safe place, and they'd violated it without a second thought. That night, I changed the locks. After Nick and his family were escorted out of my house by the police, the silence felt deafening. I stood there in my living room, surrounded by the mess they had left behind. Crumbled granola bar wrappers on the coffee table, scattered toys in the hallway, and an open bag of chips spilling onto the couch cushions. The air still smelled faintly of Amanda's cheap lavender perfume. For a few minutes, I just stood there, frozen, as the events of the last hour replayed in my mind. They had violated my space, my home, and it wasn't just the physical intrusion. It was the audacity of it, the complete disregard for my boundaries. I could still hear Nick's angry words echoing in my head. "You'll regret this, Alice. You're turning your back on your family." I had given them every chance to leave peacefully. I could have pressed charges, and part of me still wished I had. But deep down, I knew what would come of it. A long, drawn-out legal battle, more drama, more stress. I didn't want my life to revolve around their chaos any longer. So I let it go. For my own peace of mind, I chose not to press charges. That didn't mean I was going to let them walk all over me again. The first thing I did that night was call a locksmith. I wasn't about to sleep under the same roof knowing that my spare key had been passed around like some kind of invitation. The locksmith arrived within the hour, a quiet older man named Jerry. He didn't ask questions, but I could tell from the way he glanced at the mess that he knew something was wrong. "Let's get these locks replaced," he said simply, pulling his tools from his bag. I stood in the doorway as he worked, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. The chill of the night air seeped into the house, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing, thinking of all the ways they might try to come back. My mother had clearly been involved, and the thought of her colluding with Nick to invade my home made my stomach churn. "Do you want to add any additional locks or deadbolts?" Jerry asked, breaking into my thoughts. "Yes," I said quickly. "Add whatever you can. I don't care how much it costs." By the time he finished, it was past midnight. I thanked him and locked the door behind him, testing each new lock to make sure they worked. The house felt more secure, but the lingering sense of violation was still there. The next morning, I took another step to reclaim my peace. I called a home security company and scheduled an installation for that afternoon. The man who arrived, a younger guy named Marcus, walked me through all the options: cameras, motion sensors, window alarms. "Go big," I told him. "Cameras on every entry point, and make sure they're visible. I want anyone who comes near this house to know they're being watched." Marcus nodded. "We can do that. I'll add a doorbell camera too, so you can see who's at the door even if you're not home." As he worked, Claire stopped by. She hadn't seen me since the incident with Nick, but she'd heard about it through a series of frantic texts I'd sent her the night before. She walked in, took one look at my face, and immediately pulled me into a hug. "God, Alice, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I don't know, I admitted, my voice cracking. I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, like they're going to try something else. Claire pulled back, her expression hardening. They better not. And if they do, I'll help you take them down. You don't deserve this. I nodded, grateful for her support. I'm done playing nice, I said, my jaw tightening. They want to treat me like the bad guy? Fine. I'll be the bad guy. After Marcus finished installing the security system, I spent the rest of the day drafting legal warnings. Claire, who had a friend who worked in a law office, helped me write them. The letters were direct and to the point. Any further attempts to enter my property without permission would result in legal action. I sent one to Nick, one to Amanda, and one to my mother. I debated for a long time whether or not to include my dad, but in the end, I decided against it. He hadn't been directly involved in the break-in, and as much as his complacency frustrated me, I couldn't bring myself to drag him into it any further. A few days later, I got a call from my mother. Alice, what is this nonsense you sent me? She demanded, her voice sharp and indignant. It's not nonsense, I said calmly. It's a legal warning. If you or Nick try to pull something like this again, I'll press charges. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she said, her tone dismissive. We're family. Families don't threaten each other with lawyers. Families don't break into each other's houses either. I shot back. She was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone was icy. You've really changed, Alice. I don't even recognize you anymore. Good, I said, because the old Alice let you walk all over her. That's not going to happen anymore. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of power. In the weeks that followed, things began to settle down. The security cameras gave me peace of mind, and the locks ensured that no one could get in without my permission. I stopped jumping every time my phone buzzed, knowing that I wouldn't have to deal with their endless guilt trips and manipulation anymore. But the scars of their betrayal lingered. Every time I walked past the room where Nick had lounged on my couch, acting like he owned the place, I felt a pang of anger and hurt. Every time I opened a drawer and found something out of place, I wondered if they had rifled through my things while I wasn't home. Claire encouraged me to start therapy, and I finally took her advice. Talking to someone about everything, the favoritism, the manipulation, the constant pressure, helped me unpack years of resentment and hurt. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a step in the right direction. Through it all, I held on to one truth. This house was mine. They couldn't take that away from me, no matter how hard they tried.